housekeeping. Can we ask everyone to mute themselves during the course of the presentation? If you want to ask a question, and we are going to make it Q&A, but the Q&A will come at the end. So can you use the Zoom group chat facility? And Kay and a couple of the colleagues from London HR Connection are going to collate the questions, and then what we'll try and do is summarise them and put them to the panel at the end of the session. That's okay with everybody. I'm Michael Moran. I'm hosting, sadly, in Craig's place because as a result of personal circumstances, he can't be here today. Delighted to welcome you to this webinar to discuss the complex issues of supporting employees through traumatic change of all kinds. And I'm hoping, Kay, at this point, you have started the recording, including bereavement, redundancy, divorce, and of course, the emotional impact of all the changes we've been experiencing as a result of COVID-19, the pandemic. Again, please keep on mute so there's no background noise. We're going to cover a range of issues today. How change can impact us both physically and emotionally, how people respond, what we've learned so far from the experience, the ways that different organisations are adjusting and adapting ways to support employees to better cope with extreme change. I'm delighted to welcome our senior panel of HR professionals, a variety of organisations and backgrounds, and each are going to share with you their experiences and insights, and hopefully generate some ideas and a discussion on this very important topic. And so let me give them a brief introduction. We've got Josie Piley-Lowe, who's the Chief Operations and People Officer for the financial services organisation Premium Credit, where she has responsibility for both customer and employee experience. Again, can I ask you people to put themselves on mute? Before joining Premium Credit, she was the HR director at Office Shoes, adding to a lengthy career at HR level roles in the retail sector. And I'm sure we'll all appreciate that that sector currently is no stranger to change and transformation. That's Josie. Gemma Bullivant, who is the brains behind this afternoon, done all the hard work setting it up. She's a HR consultant and a grief, loss and change specialist. She helps HR leaders in 3 key areas: HR coaching, primarily coaching HR professionals; HR consulting to deliver ad hoc HR projects; and perhaps most relevant to our discussion today, grief and loss coaching, especially redundancy coaching, to help people address the impact of redundancy and accelerate their job search. She also does bereavement coaching to help employees return to work whilst grieving. And last but no means least, Karen McKeever, who is the HR director of Drax Group PLC. Drax Group PLC is a British electrical power generation company with over 2,500 employees. Karen actually started this role on day 1 of lockdown, so I'm sure she's going to have lots of interesting experiences to share. And prior to joining Drax, she was a CPO of Buzz Bingo while it was navigating its own change from Gala Leisure Limited. So, after those introductions, I'm going to go to a Q&A format, and I'm going to start with Karen. So, Karen, can you tell us a little bit about your experience of the impact of this pandemic? What changes do you need to make, and how you manage those changes as a result of this pandemic? Karen.
So thank you, everybody, and it's lovely to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I think for the approach that we had and the difference, and as Michael's just said, I joined the organisation on day 1 of the pandemic. So I have a reflection on what the organisation was like based on what I was told and where the organisation was when I joined. And I think the biggest piece for us around the change that the organisation faced into was how to very much simplify the messages that it needed to deliver to its people. And we came out with two very clear statements, objectives from the COVID-19 situation, which was to protect our people and keep the lights on. And we provide about 8% of the energy for the UK. So we were paramount in doing that to help the NHS to be able to do what they needed to do. And I think that at times of dramatic change, whether that be through trauma or through sudden change, having that very clear, pinpointed focus for us was critical, because it allowed us to make decisions and to put a decision framework around those two very key objectives for the organisation. And because of their simplicity, everybody in the organisation, from call centres through to engineers that work at our power plants, through to people that work in the mountain that you might have seen on the news recently, all understood what it was that they were there to achieve. And I think that's quite different from change that organisations often go through, where we think that we've got a really singular vision and purpose, but we don't always have that kind of level of singularity that comes from a dramatic change like COVID, where we are thrown in at the deep end. And nobody had the answers. There were no people that we could go to really talk to about what this was going to do for us as an organisation. So we had to find our way, and that forced the organisation to be agile, to have to, as I say, work quickly, to make decisions without all of the information, so in a big sense of ambiguity. So a lot of what we hear and see in what we class as strong leadership traits really came to the surface. We mobilised, as I'm sure many organisations did, a gold, silver, bronze crisis management team, and that worked incredibly well at making sure that the assigned accountabilities were shared across the organisation in a way that enabled people to know what they had to do without stepping on each other's toes, giving clear lines of accountability and responsibility. And I think that made a big difference for us. We were an organisation that weren't really very supportive of flexible working. Everybody had to be very present. That completely changed overnight when we sent all of our teams home, except for our parastation teams. And we mobilised ourselves to be able to have everybody working from home for 2 weeks, within 2 weeks of the crisis hitting and lockdown hitting us. And I think that made a massive difference. It's boosted the trust and engagement of our people, and certainly has helped our leaders and managers to see how they could work differently. So yeah, I think that's kind of the summary of where we ended up and what's different about this crisis to perhaps some of the other change that we might have faced into. And I apologise, you might hear my dog in the background. I'm trying very hard to ignore him as he goes out into the garden. I think one of the other things that we paid attention to, and we really dialed up the focus and emphasis that we paid to well-being. And although we had a very strong well-being strategy, this came to the fore for leaders who were pretty inexperienced in a lot of instances and who were suddenly working from home on Zoom calls and team calls, Skype calls, and had to really find different ways of working. So there was an enablement that we needed to put in place for people around how do we virtually help people to learn and develop and see what that needed to look like for them. What did a conversation about productivity look like? What did a conversation about how did people feeling about all of this? And at our call centre site particularly, we have a really broad range of ages, a lot of younger workers who are still living at home and still facing into quite difficult circumstances at home for one reason or another. So that whole sense of well-being focus really got dialed up. We utilised our healthcare provider to make sure they were supportive. We changed all of our learning and development options from face-to-face to virtual. And I'm sure that this isn't probably new news to people. I'm sure that lots of you are doing this already. But I think as a result of that, we had to let go of some of our limiting beliefs. Like, how do we help people to be productive when we haven't got oversight? So for anybody that works in call centres, you'll know that supervision and oversight is quite close in those environments. So we had to find technological reasons and ways of helping people to adjust to that change. And some of that was blanket, some of that was just a top-down approach. And we had to do that to really help people to be mobilised. And some of that was individual, so teams looking at what their teams needed and what their people needed at an individual level, including down to managers doing wellbeing one-to-one specifically aimed at looking at that conversation. And sorry, there's a question that's come in which I wouldn't mind answering if that's all right, Michael. So questions come in saying power stations are pretty clinical in their makeup. Yep, generally. Very regimented because of the safety aspect, of course. Was there anything different you had to reimagine or do? Yes. So because of social distancing, we couldn't have all of our people on site at the power station particularly. So we're made up of power stations, both hydro and thermal, and what was coal and is now biomass or moving to biomass, and call centres, and then our central core services function. And so we've had to, through social distancing, we've had to put people on week off shifts at our power station. We have converted spaces that were traditionally office space or were training space. We've converted that to being hubs so that we can create downtime spaces for people to be able to have time away from their workplace, but effectively still keep social distancing. And the other challenge we faced into is that we have a big outage in the summer, which is effectively where we turn down one of our power units and we do all the maintenance and everything on it. And that means that over the summer this year, we have 1,000 contractors joining the site, which, to put that into context, we would only have around 1,800 workers on site at any one time normally. So we had to halve that. And we've now had to find ways to take everybody that's not a core services worker off site. So very luckily, we didn't furlough anybody. We decided that on an ethical and values-based decision, and we decided that we would pay everybody regardless of whether they could work, were showing symptoms, had childcare challenges, etc. Now I know that not every organisation is in that space, and that did make a big difference to our people. There are a select few who want to take advantage of that, but generally I think that that's been a very positive message. So what we said from a visionary perspective to people, we then demonstrated through our role model behaviour and the actions that we took. So by protecting people, it wasn't just that we wanted to keep them safe from a health perspective. We were concerned about their well-being, we were concerned about their financial position, we were concerned about their confidence with the organisation going forward. And we did a lot of work with people around the SCARF model, so helping leaders and managers to really understand what the threat that people might see on status or certainty, the autonomy that they might be feeling, and how we could help them. And so the question that's just come in around senior leaders and help manage their own personal resilience, we did a number of different things. So initially, it was webinars to help people to understand how they could manage their teams, and in that, what they could do for themselves. We looked at working arrangements practically and looked at the flexibility that people could work on their hours. We then moved on to using external providers to look at personal resilience, and we use Lane 4's balance model, which helps people to be individually focused on their own resilience, and it gives them a toolkit to identify where they might have gaps in their own personal resilience, but it's very personal. And then around that, we've given the managers more one-to-one support with their own leaders and helped them. So I think that kind of sums up for us what we did, and I'm sure that by now that's enough, and you probably want to hear from Josie. So I'm going to hand over to Josie now and let her tell her story and where this is for her. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. And I think, and similar to you, Karen, I think that everything I'm going to say in this is probably going to be experienced by some or many of you in terms of how you've been able to react to the recent events. But if I just give you context in terms of who Premium Credit is, because I don't think anybody, when you say Premium Credit, nobody knows who it is. We're not very big on the branding map, but we're a fintech company, and we do assist customers and businesses actually to pay for their insurances on a regular instalment, as opposed to paying it upfront. So we do provide finance, and most of our business is insurance, but we do offer also other subscriptions and school things like school fees, and as well as football memberships, etc. And the main priority is to ensure that people can actually be funded to enable them to ease the pressure of payment for these kind of necessities. But essentially, like when COVID hit, like everybody else in the world, I think life changed beyond any type of comprehension that we could have ever have imagined. And we saw from across the globe, and my family was obviously, I was about to get on a plane on my annual trip back to Australia, and had to cancel that. And being so far away from a pandemic to sort of around the world, and seeing loss of lives and illnesses, widespread illness, it was really confronting, I think, for many people. And for our teams as well, and that constant disruption we've seen over the last few months has been quite overwhelming. And we know now that things will just never be the same again, and the adjustments that we've made now will be long term, and not just in the short term. But similar to Karen, I think we first went into crisis management almost immediately. Fortunate for us, we were able to actually decamp our entire team from 400 people across both the UK and Ireland to remote working overnight. And we replicated employees' workspaces in their own homes. So from dual screens, laptops, chairs, even printers if we needed. So really headsets, really tried to replicate the workspace for people to take with them. And so you would see people walking down the driveway wheeling their chairs to their cars, and taking big screens out. It was almost like it was actually a very eerie scene in our workplace, but it certainly was enabled everyone to be able to decamp almost immediately. It doesn't sound like we had a lot of employees when you put it down to 450 people, but we do have over 2 million customers to service within that. So we had that aspect of it as well, that we needed to ensure we could continue to support our customers that have relied on us with financial support. Very similar to Karen, actually, I had an extra day. So the day before lockdown, I was appointed to the chief operating part of my role, which meant that I had responsibilities, Michael said, for both the people and the operations of the company. I only had the one day to enjoy that before we went into a bit of a lockdown, and had to put in our crisis management hat on and rally around the team and make sure that everybody was equipped to do that. So it was certainly very challenging at the time to be able to do that with separate hats on, and both of those hats were very big responsibilities, because the 2 million customers and the entire workforce to support them. but as Michael mentioned, I guess in my background in retail is certainly not immune to change and large scale change at that with some of the organisations I've worked on. But I'd never been as challenged as this one, and I think this one was different. And I think it was that absolutely everybody was going through change, and it was different to changes that we would have normally in organisations, for example, where you're managing change for team members that are experiencing an organisational restructure or redundancies or even job changes. From a customer perspective, you do have individual circumstances that change, and therefore you are dealing with the emotions and managing the emotions of those customers. So there was change all over the place, and I think that this wasn't the same change. Our staff were our contacts. We had the contact centre as well that were dealing with customers that were very concerned, very emotional about the financial difficulty and hardship that they were going through, and we needed to support them in terms of how they were going to repay their loans. And we had our teams who were worried about their own jobs and whether they were going to be furloughed and what was going to happen to them, trying to be supportive of these customers. So it was really a combination of a lot of emotion and a lot of stress for all involved. So I think the point with that is that I think everybody was going through change. It's just that everyone wasn't going through the same change, but they were going through some kind of change of their own. And the difference was that everybody was going through it at the same time. And that difference I found was the combination of change with every stakeholder actually created a profound intensity for everyone involved. So it was the intensity is probably is the right word. I don't know if that describes it enough, and if it's powerful enough to actually describe what I was seeing across both from external and internal stakeholders. Our team were trying to navigate through a new world of working, and they didn't have, and again, some of the entry-level roles, such as the contact centre, they didn't have their managers sitting down a couple of seats down to be able to escalate an issue for a customer. They had to navigate how to contact their manager to escalate. They didn't have a neighbouring department to ask questions and to resolve issues. So everything took longer. The calls that we were receiving were over 400% in addition to what we normally get, and they would take longer because customers would refuse to call a close to the calls until they had the answers they wanted, and our staff weren't able to give them those answers, particularly in the early days. So again, just to sort of describe the intensity of that change. So one of the first things that we did was actually heighten our communication and the presence of the leadership team. We needed to change everything we did with that, the frequency, our channels, our processes, our whole approach from the beginning was aimed at actually stepping up our human interaction, and when we felt it was needed the most, and that retained that sense of togetherness that we felt was really important for the teams to be able to actually get through whatever experience they were experiencing, and no matter how small or large, but we felt that we needed to bring us together as a team. And it was certainly the right thing to do. And as you said, Karen, we very much put our wellbeing strategy at the forefront of our agenda. We focused on the mental and physical wellbeing of our employees and ensured that they had everything that they needed to do in their job and in their new environment. And that was really key to us to do that. We recognised how hard everyone was working through this period, and we wanted them to know how much we really appreciated that. We kept the teams informed with whatever we knew. We were very transparent in terms of things that we knew. We progressed almost ahead of government guidelines as we went through the pandemic, and then as we knew more, we would ensure to communicate that and share that. We had weekly leadership calls. We had twice daily communication, emails. We used Teams as our main source of communication. It was really important that we encouraged and we led by example in terms of video and not just calls, because I think that physical presence again enabled that togetherness and really enabled us to ensure people weren't alone in this. We introduced coffee roulettes, and I know many have seen on LinkedIn and various social sights of the success of coffee roulettes, and I think that was one of the best things we did. We were able to introduce small coffee roulettes and groups of coffees for people to get to know each other, and particularly the leadership team, that we wouldn't normally do otherwise. I don't think we would have actually got to meet, well, I certainly wouldn't have got to meet my 300 new staff as quickly as I would have actually without that. So it was certainly a different world, and it was working. And I think that was probably the main point was to include and show and show our hand as a leadership team. We mandated lunch breaks, so that way we wouldn't have meetings on the lunch breaks, because we're very conscious of the screen time and how long a day would be in front of the screen. I think that was, and even with the intensity, the volumes of work that we were dealing with during that time added to that. So we also introduced early finish Fridays to help people extend that weekend for them, which was really well welcomed. And I don't think we can get out of that now. So I think that's just going to be the way forward. And I think similar to Karen, I think we had a very traditional work site. We were flexible, but working from home was not a common thing. It was based on exception and request, and it was almost not frowned upon, but it just wasn't as accepted as it is now. And I think it's that. And like, I think because we're all in it together, I think that makes a big difference. And when there's a hybrid way of working, I think that may change some of the behaviours and some of the perceptions. But I think it's certainly you can't go back now when so many people are pleading for it to be the way forward. And we did do a survey recently, and desperately people wanted to ensure that we continued that. On every weekly leadership call, it was asked of us whether we were going to make this a permanent arrangement, and some even asked whether they could change the work attire and include slippers on the list. So certainly something that was favourable. But I think that if I go back to the original question, I think Michael asked was, in terms of what we focused on and the changes that we needed to make. And I think we focused on the intangible. We focused on ensuring that people had that presence, and that we had the presence, that we were seen, and that their well-being and was looked after, and we were able to actually ensure we heightened that. So, with the coffees and the team meetings and the leadership calls and all of those that we did was just to ensure that our teams felt that they had a team, and that we had a business and that we could rely on. And we certainly showed our hand as a leadership team to let them know that they weren't alone, and what they were experiencing is what we were experiencing. And I think on one of the calls, each of the leadership members actually just had 5 minutes each. We would introduce backgrounds in teams, and we would we had a competition. We asked our team to suggest themes and backgrounds for us as a bit of entertaining, and we had to draw each other at one point, and it was scary. It was actually, I'm so glad I didn't get the CEO, because that would have been a little bit of a career suicide, I think, but because my drawing skills aren't very good. But it just created a bit of fun and a bit of sense of fun in amongst the turmoil that people were experiencing. And we got to the point where teams were actually letting us know that they were looking forward to the half-hour calls each week. I know they didn't have much else to do, but I think this was it was really encouraging for us to hear that the team, really looked forward to jumping on a Teams call with us, and hearing what we had to say, and seeing us working together. And I don't think they would have seen that otherwise. And I think so, it is a silver lining, certainly, of things that have come out in the way we work, in the way we've interacted, and certainly in terms of that loyalty we've created as part of the business. And the environment. And I think, Karen, you touched on purpose, and I think this has strengthened our purpose, definitely strengthened our purpose. And I think people more than ever have wanted to know why we do what we do. And I think it's been very powerful, actually. And it's interesting that you touched on that as well. And I think, and I'm sure many organisations have as well, that sense of togetherness has probably given you that drive, or given us the drive to be able to actually move forward together through the good, bad, and ugly, I guess, in terms of the turmoil. So I think that as a result of focusing on the intangibles and focusing on the teams and what they needed to replicate what they had in the office, I think enabled us to get through what we needed to get through. Our service levels were able to be maintained with our customers. We were able to assist customers with their repayments and financing, and ensure that they were as much as we possibly could, and we were able to do that. And fortunately enough, we were not as impacted financially as we would expect to have been. So I think yeah, I guess that's the key point, was that we focused on the intangibles rather than the tangibles, but that gave us the results we needed all round. Yeah, I think Gemma might have something to add to that, perhaps.
Gemma, you would like to come in? And by the way, I know, Teresa, you've asked a question of Josie. We will come back to that, I promise.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see it. I wasn't playing around with my tools on the Zoom. So I'll come back to that then. Yeah.
Yeah, so you know, just to follow on from Karen and Josie, my focus, I suppose, just a little bit about me. I come from an HR background, much like Josie and Karen and many people on this call. I was an in-house HR person and senior for quite a number of years, and sort of probably in total over 20 years. And I went independent about 5 years ago. And in that move, I effectively split my time quite equally between consulting and coaching. Now, a lot of my consulting work, even though as a generalist by trade, I can pretty much turn my hand to anything, a lot of my consulting work was sort of quite future focused, sort of projects and so on, which clearly, as we've heard, and as everybody on this call will no doubt support in terms of experience, it's not been a time for those sorts of projects. So my shift really, and some of the focus that's happened to me, has been around actually kind of tapping into some of the other stuff that I do around coaching. I'm often asked why I got into grief and bereavement and change and loss, because it is quite a specific topic. And the short answer to that is I was bereaved myself 10 years ago, and at that time was in a senior HR role, expected to basically kind of, you know, bounce back pretty quickly, manage things very quickly, and found it was actually quite challenging to get the kind of support that I needed and that I felt I needed. And I became sort of much more attuned to the power of coaching and the place that coaching has within that space, which is not to say that it replaces counselling or is a better option than counselling, but just more that it also has a part to play. So I trained in grief and bereavement. I kind of added that to my coaching training, and then sort of started to work with clients around grief. And I suppose quite surprisingly got about a third of my clients were grief in relation to bereavement, but a third were to do with redundancy, and another third were probably to do with relationship ends and divorce and those sorts of things. So I very quickly realized that grief is everywhere. Grief is change. And the term grief is often sort of wrongly kind of twinned with bereavement, and it is much broader than bereavement. The term grief is really applicable to all types of change. So I then kind of have drawn on those sorts of principles to sort of, you know, evolve the kind of coaching that I offer, the kind of initiatives and support that I offer, and, you know, the sort of work that I've sort of been doing more and more of more recently. So as that consulting work that I referred to has kind of quietened down a little bit, where the volume has turned up massively is all around grief, change, and supporting individuals and organisations in actually managing that well-being side of things, individual circumstances, and a kind of a general, I think, raising of awareness of what grief and loss really is, and how ill-equipped we mostly are, I would say, as a society in actually kind of positively and proactively managing grief and loss. And I say that across the board. You know, it is something that I think we are on a steep learning curve about most recently. The focus for me has been around flexibility to adapt. So kind of taking a step back and going, okay, where can my skills add most benefit and value? You know, there's so much going on. How can this, you know, what do I know that I can actually kind of share and help and evolve, or kind of just sort of dial up, if you like, in terms of the sorts of things that I do. So that speed and flexibility to adapt has been really key, which I think is probably, you know, sounds like that's been the experience in other ways with both what Josie and Karen have described. And I guess they, you know, they do say necessity is the mother of invention, and I've become quite creative in the sorts of things that I've been evolving and helping people with. But when I did that kind of reflection on what I've got to offer, it became very apparent to me, that link between grief and loss and the change that everybody is experiencing, but that everybody is experiencing in a different way. So it's this strange situation where everybody's got the same the same kind of, you know, thing going on as a sort of a, you know, an overlying set of circumstances, but yet everybody's unique circumstances mean that they have their own individual response and priorities to that. The foundation principles of working with grief and with trauma and traumatic change, I think, are so applicable that I just wanted to share them with you, because both Karen and Josie have touched on them already. But one of the principles is about keeping safe. So when we experience trauma and change, there is you know, there can be a physical threat or risk, as we have with the virus. And there's also the emotional well-being and resilience side of things as well, and mental health to keep safe in terms of that principle. There's also I guess, the ability to cope with the change, the ability to kind of build our resilience, to understand kind of how we are responding to the change, and actually to find ways to actually build our resilience to that. There's inevitably always a sense of restoring choice and control. So I often refer to choice and control in coaching across a wide range of things, but it comes up time and time again with grief and with change, around, especially when a change has been forced upon us, which is obviously what happens with that kind of change, and we feel like we've had our choices and our control taken away. So there's a really important step about actually kind of helping the individual or the team or the organization regain that sense of choice and control, and sort of think about how things need to be reframed and repositioned. Facilitating connection. I mean, we know it from lockdown, we know it from kind of the idea of being kind of isolated, people who have to shield. Isolation is a core theme in grief. When we experience grief and bereavement of any, and grief of any kind, we have a tendency to retreat. We have a tendency to isolate, and so that sense of restoring connection is really important in grief coaching. So hey, guess what, it's really important in what we're dealing with at the moment, as well as we've been hearing about the great kind of initiatives to kind of, you know, reconnect people, albeit differently. And overarching all of that is that theme of individuality. You know, I've heard the expression, we're in the same storm, but we're not necessarily all in the same boat. We all have our own unique set of individual circumstances, and whenever I meet with a client, I that is the very first principle that is always applied, is this person's set of responses is informed by their own set of circumstances, their own beliefs, their own behaviours, their own experiences, the different pressures that have been going on, and so on. So there's that individuality that I think is really important for us to sort of hold on to. So those trauma principles have really helped to inform some of the things that I've been helping organisations and individual clients with.
Can I just interrupt for a second? Can you tell us a bit more about how you think people typically experience grief and loss?
Yeah, I will do, and I've prepared a couple of slides as well, just because some of the things that I'm talking about, you know, it's useful to have some visual as well. So if people can sort of see a screen, that might help as well. But I'm going to start with the well, now I've said I've got slides. My screen has now frozen. There we go. I'm going to start with Kübler-Ross. Kübler-Ross is simply the most well-known model of change and emotions of change. But I'm going to put a huge caveat up here, which is to say I don't particularly like it in the context of organisational change. I don't like it in the context of grief either. But it has got some uses. And the reason I use it is primarily because it's the most well-known. And it does surface some really important things. It surfaces the importance of emotion and responses, and that individuals respond in a particular way. Where it's less helpful is it's really oversimplified, and it's the linear representation just does not represent how we experience change and how we experience grief. And almost it kind of sets a sort of a set of expectations that we're going to follow a process. We're going to start here, we're going to start with denial, and we're going to end up with acceptance. And grief just doesn't work like that. We get thrown around all over the place. There are far more emotions that we might experience than simply the 5 up there. And, you know, Kübler-Ross certainly examined more than the 5. But the curve was actually never intended to be used for organisational change. It came from research studying terminally ill patients. So it came from research of observations around how those patients were responding to their set of circumstances. It was then extrapolated to kind of, you know, grief in terms of how we experience the bereavement. And then it was extrapolated further into change more broadly and organisational change. So it's stretched itself across some things in quite some way. But the things that it does do really well, I then use and take kind of into a different context. We know that we get stuck. We know that we kind of, you know, find that we get thrown around. It's not a linear process. And one of the things that the curve doesn't help us with is the idea of action. Grief and change requires us to take action. So it isn't just about how we respond, but it's what we do and how we help ourselves with the responses that we have. So I like to take these emotions and use a more kind of coaching approach and an energy management approach, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, just to help actually people to not only identify what those emotions are that they're experiencing, the responses that they're having. So we've seen them all, you know, we've seen people in denial about the virus. We've seen people get angry about various aspects of, you know, of the circumstances. I'm not suggesting that we don't actually see what's happening with this change curve, but what I do actually say isn't true is the journey that it represents, and also it doesn't really help us with what to do to sort of move through to a more positive place. So what I prefer is an emotional energy management system. Bear with me, I'll explain what I mean by that. You'll see some of the emotions there in capitals are kind of from the change curve. There are hundreds of emotions. You could plot any number of emotions, and in fact that's one of the things I do sometimes with clients who are really struggling in this space, is to identify what are the emotions that you're experiencing, and then let's actually categorize them. Let's try and do our bit to making what's complicated much more simple. And so you think about things in terms of whether they take a lot of energy and are quite depleting, are those high energy ones which go along the top, and the lower energy ones, the things that don't take much out of us, go along the bottom. And then, you know, is it helpful or is it negative or unhelpful, or is it positive and helpful? And then that determines whether it goes left or right. And what we're looking to do then is to say, okay, so clearly where we want to be is on this left-hand side, on the right-hand side where we're in flow, we're doing great stuff, we're feeling energized, we're feeling kind of, you know, like we can make stuff happen. But that stuff takes a lot of energy. So, you know, then we need to make sure that we stay on the right-hand side in a low energy capacity so that we can recover and re-energize so that we can stay on that right-hand side. But we're not in a linear process. So we're going to get thrown over into the left-hand side, into the less helpful areas. We're going to assume some of those fight or flight kind of responses from time to time. So it's not about sort of beating ourselves up whenever we're over on the left-hand side. It's about noticing when we're on the left-hand side. It's about noticing when we're in those fight or flight frames of mind. The fight ones take a lot of energy out of us, and the flight ones are effectively where we can end up feeling very burnt out. So what we need to do is find ways to, first of all, identify what we're feeling and how those are on that sort of those quadrants, which quadrants they belong to, and then find ways to be intentionally and purposefully on that right hand side, flexing between being in flow and being in recovery. And if we find ourselves in the negative side, which we will from time to time, how do we actually kind of notice that, catch it, and get ourselves across to the more positive side? So this is a system that I prefer in when I'm talking about kind of, you know, how you can sort of build resilience, how you can maintain, sustain your well-being, your emotional energy, to help actually kind of recognize some of those responses that we typically see in relation to change, in relation to all forms of loss, which change is one, and how we can actually help ourselves to be in a more positive space. And before I finish on this, I just want to kind of, I said I don't particularly, this is one model I use and I like a lot. And another model that I use specifically within the grief context is one called the dual process model. Quite a busy one, but actually very, very simple. So this is effectively saying that we zigzag between two modes. It's not linear. It's the very opposite of linear. It's a zigzag, and sometimes we're on the left-hand side, which is all about loss orientation. That's effectively the discomfort, right the way through to the intense pain that we might feel with grief. But it's everything to do with kind of the pain and discomfort that loss is causing us. Over on the right-hand side is called restoration, but that's actually basically just getting on with life. That's kind of being doing your day job. And I use this a lot with grief clients who need to kind of get their head round bereavement and grieving whilst returning to work, having to kind of deal with things, having to kind of work through things, and effectively noticing that they're going to zigzag between the two. Sometimes they'll do that intentionally, and sometimes that will just happen because grief is like that. And the number of clients I've worked with this model who have had the most enormous light bulb moments that actually this is just normal, this is what happens. We've almost been duped into thinking there's a process to follow. And actually the process is that you zigzag between these two and you spend time in both to fully kind of work your way through the impact that change has had on you emotionally, and how you're going to actually then kind of work with that energy management system and other things that I do to actually kind of help kind of bring you back onto a more even keel. And I think in terms of organizations, I think one of the parallels to this is actually we've got a bit of zigzagging that happens, and that can sometimes throw us because we're expecting to move through some nice, neat, tidy stages. And really it's about kind of being flexible, being adaptive to kind of when things kind of zigzag. And we need to sort of be conscious that people are all experiencing those zigzags at slightly different times. Does that help answer that question, Michael?
It certainly does. Thank you very much, Gemma. I think that's two very interesting models. I'm going to go a little bit off script, because I think, having had the three inputs, maybe we should ask some questions at this stage before we come into summarising lessons learned. And I'm very concerned or conscious that, Teresa, you asked a question of Josie. Josie, you've had a chance to see in the chat. Would you like to respond?
I need to unmute myself, sorry. The question was, do you experience, thank you, Teresa, do you experience the leaders leaders are connecting on a more emotional level with the teams during lockdown? Absolutely, and for lots of reasons. And I think, you know, some of the actions that we took, and many organisations took around that togetherness and being able to actually have that presence, enabled that to be cascaded through the business. So a lot of leaders did show that a different level and a different style of leading than they've ever had to do before. So we certainly saw that as a sheer nature of what was going on, and the forums that we were creating to do that. We did have an online presence and online management system, so that enabled us to actually inject the relevant programs for leadership during these times, and there were things in there about how to had to have, you know, difficult conversations, and not just in difficult conversations from a performance management perspective in the traditional terms, but very, you know, how do you support somebody that is actually going through a difficult time, and potentially some form of grief. So there was a lot of training invested in that, but that was certainly helped as well. But there was a natural inclination to connect on that emotional level from a lot of the leaders in the business.
Thank you, Josie. And in the absence of any other questions, I want to use my role as the moderator. Karen, a question for you. You talked about oversight, and particularly managers coming to terms with not having physical oversight. How did you overcome that problem? And in particular, did you use any technological solutions to give them that oversight?
Yeah, we did. It was this was sort of a second round of the IT piece. So very much like Josie, our enablement was very much about the laptops, the screens, the chairs, etc., to get to people to start with. And then for our call centre population, which is about 1,400 people over normally 4 sites around the country, it then became quite apparent that we wanted to identify where people were productive. So our IT team worked with the call centre leaders to look at how we might be able to monitor people so that managers could still give that oversight and give the perspective that you heard Josie talk about, that was where they would go to get advice. So actually that practical, how do I tap into my manager when they're not sat next to me, or my supervisor when they're not sat next to me? So that helped leaders. And actually what we found was that when they weren't there, our people made decisions, and then we had to make it okay for them to make those decisions. So this sense of absorbed empowerment and engagement happened quite quickly, that our colleagues quite quickly realised that they had to make those decisions because, like Josie explained, they were facing into customers who didn't want to get off the phone until they'd had an answer to how they were going to pay their electricity, or could they move on to a new tariff. So there was this sudden sense of empowerment for our colleagues, and because of that, our managers then started to focus much more on the trends and on the oversight of productivity rather than on the minutiae of productivity. So yes, I would say technology did help us to be able to do that, and I'd say we're still not there yet properly with it all. There's still a lot more work to be done, because like Josie, we're not going to bring people back to the offices. We're not going to have everybody back in offices in the same way that we had before. So there's still more to be done in that space.
Thank you, Karen. And before I turn to Tom Cassidy's question, you also referenced David Rock's SCARF model, didn't you?
Yeah.
So for those who are not familiar with it, before I come to Tom's question.
Yeah, certainly. So this is David Rock's scarf model, which is looking at, and I'm probably going to very badly quote this, so please do look this up and research it afterwards, which effectively looks at those things that when we are having a bad day, what are the triggers for that bad day? Is it probably the simplest way to describe it? So status, if our status is threatened, we can, that creates this fight or flight response in us. If our certainty, if we don't have certainty, then that can create it in us. Autonomy, if our autonomy is taken away from us, or we don't have the autonomy we think we should have, then that can affect it. If our relationships, our relatedness it's called, is affected, then that can create that defensiveness. And then fairness. So for us, there was this real sense that lots of people going through the emotions of this change were being impacted in very different ways because different things were affecting them. To Jen's point earlier, everybody goes through this very individually and separately, and there's lots of other models. That's a very simple model for us to use, but it helped us understand what it was at an individual level that was impacting on how people felt.
Thank you, Karen. I think that's a very good explanation of the scarf model, if I may say so.
Thank you very much. I can take no credit.
Yeah, that's very good. So we've had now a couple of questions around sort of mental health and well-being. Tom asked, are we still navigating our way through the storm? And Keith asked in particular on mental health first aid as an intervention. Gemma, would you like to start? And then I'll come to Karen and Josie.
Yeah, sure. So there's a question from Keith around awareness, which I'll take first. And I think that the short answer is that we are seeing a much bigger, a much better acknowledgement of the importance of mental health, and the fact that grief and loss are connected to mental health is something I've been saying for many years. And I think that overall, any organisation that puts mental health wellness onto its agenda is doing a number of things, both ethically, it's the right thing to do, but actually it's been seen time and again, and Deloitte have just done a study on the fact that if we support individual well-being, we do see the ROI for that. So if the ethical argument doesn't support it, then certainly the commercial ones certainly does. That's to say that actually one of the things that I've said for a long time is that all forms of change relate to a grief response in some way. And I've got another question that sort of talks a little bit about whether change, are we through it? Is this now something that we're going to we've kind of come through that, or are there going to be longer term effects? So the question is there any planning or consideration for the longer term effects as a result of this, or are we still navigating our way through the storm? Absolutely, we need to be thinking about this on the longer term. I think we need to be thinking about this entire experience for people is fundamental, and any experience that is fundamental has an impact on us that we have to acknowledge. And I think if we can raise the awareness of that, that's certainly a passion of mine. If organisations can play their part in actually kind of enabling those conversations to happen, equipping managers, equipping all staff to feel comfortable to be able to talk about these things, to feel comfortable that these are worth doing, these are conversations worth having, and to feel equipped and comfortable that it is the whole person that comes to work. You don't leave half of your life at the door or at the virtual door. And I suppose when we're sitting in our home offices, it's almost opened that door a little bit, because we can see the people who have got the children running around the place, or the other things happening. We can see how our whole person is at work in a way that it really hasn't been before. And what I hope is that helps and encourages an organisation and cultural shift to really and truly acknowledge that the whole person comes to work, and therefore the whole person should be invited to be having those sorts of conversations with their managers and with their colleagues at work, that actually then, you know, does that kind of has that support, you know, impact on that individual's well-being.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Josie. On the issue of mental health and well-being, and you mentioned that obviously you'd had frontline staff who were taking calls, particularly from irate, emotional, concerned, stressed clients or customers. Did you put in place any training, A, for that experience, and B, the ramifications of that in terms of individuals' well-being? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, we did, and Michael, I think, you know, a lot of that, we had employee assistant programs in place already, and we certainly ramped them up a lot more during these times. We added breaks in for our teams, etc., to ensure that they were getting that right, that you know, released some of that intensity that I was talking about earlier. We increased the number of mental health first aiders in our organisation as well. But I think one of the things that I found, and it links into sort of what Gemma was talking about, the whole being in the workplace. I think, you know, that having that vulnerability from a leadership team to the teams, to the rest of the organisation, and actually letting them know that it's okay not to be okay on those leadership calls, and being able to actually share our own grief and our own emotions, and to be real to the teams, I think certainly helped, because what that did is it unleashed the opportunity for people to talk about that in a way that they wouldn't never have, I guess, spoken about it in as freely as they have, because here we are as a leadership team on a leadership call every week, and we make a point of saying what we're doing to try to help our own well-being and our own environment, and really showing our hand, again, as I mentioned before, our vulnerability about what the lockdown was doing to us and what the pandemic was doing to us. And I think that really certainly did help with some of those emotions. Going forward, to your point, I guess we are looking at well-being is still at the front of the agenda, and will remain to be, because I think that's not going to go away anytime soon. And I think the storm is yet to disappear, and I think that's going to be with us for a long time coming. So I think certainly the programs that we've put in place are looking at a lot more of that. And you know, if once we get through some of the more of the questions, it'd be good. I just wanted to talk about just some of the leadership programs that we're looking at putting in place, which I think is really important as well to help with some of that.
Thank you, Josie. Karen, is there anything you'd like to add? And then what I'm going to ask you to lead on to is what you think are the most important learnings for your organisation.
So like Josie and Gemma have both said, we had mental health first aiders in place, and what we quickly realised is they were very few and far between. We only had them in one part of our organisation, so we're now moving to having more across the organisation and doing a whole series of webinars and e-learning around mental health awareness. So that's some of our support, just to say. So I think it's very similar to what Josie and Gemma were saying. I think the key learnings for us were to allow some of the shackles of the bureaucracy of the past to be let go, and to give our managers some freedom and autonomy to be able to make decisions locally, and to do that within a framework. A big piece for us was joining up that sense of the well-being that we paid attention to our internal people, to our communities. So I think there was a question about, did we have any negative emotions played out at group level? No, in fact, quite the opposite. So we did a lot of work to give laptops to school kids, to set up debt helplines for our customers that we fund now, and we're funding that for the next year to 18 months, to work with communities that were very badly hit by COVID, and to look at what we could do locally. So that might be home pads, boots and stuff for some of our colleagues in that respect as well. So we joined up what we did for our people internally with what we did externally in our community, and made that quite public internally to our business, so that they knew that we weren't just looking after them, we were also looking after the wider environment and the wider community as well. So I think that was a key learning for us. Another key learning for us was that we can mobilise quite quickly when we want to, and we can use a crisis management structure effectively, and that worked really well for us. And it's challenged. We now have 2 projects working on the future. So we have a project called Bounce Forward. So nobody talks about going back. We all talk about bouncing forward to a new way of working, picking up the best of what we've got currently. And we're looking at what that looks like, starting with introducing smart working policies, eventually looking to want to move to more agile working, which is a big step for us. And then we have another project looking at the transition. So looking at the practical things we need to do to help people to be mobilised, to be able to return to work at a point at which we want them to return. But like you've heard already, I think for us it was joining up the external support with the internal support. It was recognising the strength of our leadership and trusting them to do the right things. It was directing action where we needed to. It was definitely situational leadership in action. It was directing where we needed to, being very clear where we needed to, and being very clear where we were just putting frameworks in place for people to decide against. And as I said earlier, we were very lucky. We were able to make pay decisions that we were just going to keep pay for everybody. So I think there are key. There's probably a lot more around all of that, but I'll let Josie and Gemma come in with their thoughts.
And Josie, before you come in, and I'm very conscious that Tom's asked the question and he doesn't feel we've answered it, which is clearly taking the model that Gemma's present. Do we think we can bring that into organisations? Do you have a view on that?
Oh, for me, is it directed to Gemma? No, yep, I'm happy to answer that.
See, and then I'm also going to ask the same question of Karen.
Okay, so yes, I think that there is certainly something in that, isn't there, in terms of the way that we do manage those emotions and being able to actually go from the various stages as Gemma articulated in the model. And I think certainly there is something there in terms of the leadership styles as we move forward to be able to ensure that we incorporate those kind of skills, and how do you navigate your way through that and navigate your team through that to ensure that they remain engaged and remain with their sort of also impacting the mental health that they may be experiencing or not through times of change. So I do think that needs to be. I don't think there's enough out there to do to be able to actually make such a dent, the dent that we need. But certainly there's an opportunity to put more into the programs that we have for leaderships in that. Yeah.
I would agree with Josie. I mean, we've just started our Management Excellence Programme, which is our mid-level management development programme. It's free for anybody to nominate themselves for. And we actually use the Lane 4 model of change, which I know Gemma's view on the Kübler-Ross change curve. It uses the Kübler-Ross change curve, but it associates leadership behaviours to help people where they're bouncing around, to help them move through that process flow, recognising that it isn't a process. So we already use that in our management development programmes. And what this did obviously was allowed us to just dial that work up for people and to help them to understand what specifically when you've got somebody who's in denial or who's in that shock element, what is it that we can do as leaders to help them? So we built that into the wellbeing conversations that we had and gave our managers. It was a bit, it was very much hand holding, but we've got a lot of inexperienced managers and leaders that are first line leaders and managers who've never faced into anything like this. So we gave them a format to follow that talked about the different questions they could ask, the different approaches they could take to help people, and recognising from the answers where people were in those phases. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and a little bit hand-holding and scripted, but it certainly for those inexperienced managers it helped.
Just to build on that, Karen, as well, I think that, you know, as I said, the emotions that are kind of surfaced in some of these models, even if the process itself, I feel, is a little flawed, they're the gold dust, if you like, and they're the things to sort of really, you know, focus on. Overall, if that feels too much, then my go-to option is adopting a coaching style of management is going to help to address all of these things, because the minute the manager is taking a coaching approach, they are actually inviting the people that they're talking to, the people in their teams, to tell them what's going on for them, and that will enable that conversation to happen. And if you're enabling a manager to coach, you do obviously need to equip them with how to deal with things that feel uncomfortable, and having some of those courageous conversations from the context of, you know, emotional vulnerability and emotional awareness. So I think whichever model you choose, we've talked about a few. It's actually kind of raising emotional intelligence that I think is the key to actually kind of helping to support some of this stuff going forwards.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gemma. So I'm going to go back to you, Josie, in terms of your reflections on the lessons that the organisation learned.
Yeah, and it certainly, thank you, and it certainly feeds into exactly what we've been talking about. And I think if I just context, I think we talked about the engagement levels that we've had. We did, you know, conduct a survey I mentioned earlier. We had, you know, a 97% engagement rate, which is absolutely incredible and very positive. I read recently though that we're not alone. What this has done, actually, the pandemic, the lockdown, and the way that organisations have responded to that has actually increased engagement generally across the organisation. So we weren't as special as we thought we were when we first received those results, and I think people genuinely felt more engaged, but there was definitely that sense of camaraderie around the business. So I think the challenge for us and the reflection for us is, how do we maintain that? As things start to disperse, how do we actually maintain that level of engagement, and take what worked out of these environments and the changes? Do we do that? So I think some of the when we talked about returning to work, and we talked about the options and whether people would return back to how it was, and we definitely won't go to the extreme to our traditional way of working, and we've agreed that we would do an opt-in approach, so people will be able to opt in to go back into the office, and we'll support the remote working, which has made a lot of our teams very, very happy about that. However, we do have traditional managers in the business, and in saying that, they're raising concern about, well, how do I know my team are going to be productive, and how do I know this, and how do I manage that, and particularly around those entry-level roles. So there was something that I read many, many years ago that's actually served me well in my career. A quote. The book was The Extraordinary Leader, and I think it was an anonymous quote from an anonymous source. And the quote was that to be an effective leader, one must lead by absence. And that's when you can define success as a leader, is to be able to lead by absence. And I think that is the learning from this experience. How do we get our managers, or our managers, to be leaders, and to lead when they're not going to see their teams in a remote environment? How do we get them to be better at leading by absence? And I think that's the leadership focus, that's the development that we're going to really back at our organisation. And I think exactly to the point, Gemma, you made around some of that emotional intelligence, some of those skills that we normally reserve for more senior roles, we need to actually start instilling at that entry level for management, because they are going to be needing to lead teams in a very, very different environment to have they've been before, and for the entry level roles, and for those roles that do need that additional motivation to stay focused and to be able to actually get the job done. So we're going to invest in heavy programs at our leadership level, where, you know, the leaders of the future, if you like, and we're going to look at things like empathy, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, listening, and you know, really, really listening. So listening when things aren't being said. So I think that that is all going to be, you know, a program and a leadership focus for us as we go forward and as part of our learning. And I think it's just going to take us to a new level of skill in the organisation, where it's the intelligent, the intellectual and the emotional curiosity needs to be ramped up in an environment where not just today, but for the future. And as I said, I think in my opening was very much that things will never be the same. And this is about investing in our teams, in our management team, to be able to actually lead into the future, whether it's within our organisation or another. They will be faced with the same challenges. We'll all be faced with the same challenges, and I think that you know, is going to be critical more than ever. And I think it can bring into Tom's question. You know, is this something we can bring into the future? Absolutely. And I think we just need to be better at and more focused and pivot our lessons. So from our perspective, I think that is something that is a real reflection for us, and to be able to ensure that we focus on that going forward. I don't know, Gemma and Karen, whether you've got anything to add to that, but I think we've pretty much echoed our thoughts on that, haven't we?
I think so, yes. I think, you know, there's a couple of things I'd just sort of say. One is that from my perspectives, some of the kind of the main learnings have really been that kind of that solid reminder that grief and change are inextricably linked, and that they are all forms of loss of some description. A change is a sort of a unlearning something that's a learned behavior, and then relearning something else, or learning a new something else. That's effectively what change is, and that means that what we're doing is we're losing something. We might be embracing something new, but we are losing something as well. There was an earlier question from Teresa that we missed somehow, which was all around Bridges' transition model. And yes, I do refer to that. And in fact, that's one of the things that I look at quite a lot in terms of grief. For those not familiar with it, it's about endings and new beginnings. And one of the things that I've really learned and taken from this experience so far that kind of mirrors some of the work I do with grief is the importance of getting the balance right, letting go of the past. So that's all that sense of ending, saying goodbye to something that has been lost, being in the moment. And we know about kind of the importance of sort of presence and mindfulness and so on, and also looking to the future. And not being afraid to look to the future, even if we can't really see what the future holds, is still actually making sure that we get the balance right between those three things. And that effectively is kind of what that model is. So if you want to learn about that, that's been kicking around as a model for quite some time, and is quite a good one too. I just want to also pick up on another question that was actually sent to me privately, and that, I don't know if that was by mistake or not, but it was a question around, is everybody experiencing grief? And my answer to that is actually yes. And so long as we're not afraid of the word grief, and we actually say, well, what is it that we're experiencing? We are all experiencing grief at varying levels. We experience it most of the time. I'm not saying every day, but certainly we experience change all of the time. And it's only when that change is significant or unwanted or multiple and large that we feel its impact, or we notice its impact. But at a sort of a varying degrees of intensity, we're all experiencing forms of grief all the time. And it's about actually kind of acknowledging that, and being able to process that and deal with that in the proactive way that I described before as one way of dealing with it, that I think is where the power is in terms of building and sustaining our resilience and our well-being and our ability to actually kind of work within a changing environment. So I just wanted to sort of, finish on those points really.
I think, and Gemma, if I may, just very quickly on that, I think, some of the discussions that we've had with some of our teams as well, and, your point around the grief, it is a form of loss, or it's been a form of dealing with loss. And I think even people's commute to work, their daily routines and things that have not been, that have been familiar to them, that have, are no longer there, I think is certainly a form of grief that people may not be aware or define it that way, but it is certainly, a loss that I think we really don't acknowledge, and probably understated in a lot of what's going on at the moment, and our standard routines have disrupted, and I think if we don't acknowledge them a loss, that we certainly question our emotions to that and our reactions to that. So I think it's just to sort of lead on from what you've just said.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time. We're coming up to 10 to 6, so I really want sort of one final takeaway from each of the three speakers that our audience can sort of reflect on and hopefully sort of act on. And I'm going to start with Karen.
Oh God, how do I distill all of that down to one piece?
Yeah.
I think the one takeaway is, and it plays to this piece around grief, is not to be frightened of undoing things and putting new things in place for people, and not be frightened that that new thing that's in place isn't necessarily perfect, but if you can make it iterative. We've involved our colleagues with a lot of what we've done and got feedback from them through surveys or through forums or through our voice forum, and that's made a massive difference, where we can directly say, yep, we're doing this, but we haven't got it right. And if I may just indulge, I think the other piece is communication. And it goes without saying that at times like this, I think you've got to really put emphasis and focus on how you communicate and keep people informed about what's happening, so they don't move down the crooked thinking route. You give them as much certainty as they can get. My feedback.
Thank you, Karen. Josie?
And like Karen, it's probably hard to pin down to one takeout. So I think what the situation has given us the opportunity to humanise, regardless of what role you play in an organisation. And I think we've seen the breakdown of the hierarchy, of the traditional hierarchy in an organisation, through that togetherness and us experiencing some form of loss, if you like, and some form of change within the current environment. So I think from our perspective, I think it's really challenging ourselves in terms of our leaders and how we lead forward and how we create that loyalty and engagement. And again, taking learnings from what we have gone through and taking them forward, because I think as we do go forward into a hybrid working environment, we are going to lose some of that togetherness, and we're going to lose some of the power we've been able to create under these circumstances. And it's taking that and bringing that forward. And I think it's about that leadership aspect that I talked about earlier, ensuring that we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And I think the key is around ensuring focus of authenticity around our leadership team. And I think that is going to be so important now and into the future. And I think because that is what people have seen now, and people have seen that vulnerability of that. And I think that's been quite powerful. And I think it's really, really important to ensure that continues into the way forward, which is, I think not going to go away for a long time.
It wasn't one takeaway, but it was three.
Yeah. Did I manage that well then?
And finally, Gemma.
Yeah, I think for me, it is about that acknowledgement that change is a form of grief, and let's not get frightened by the term grief. Let's actually just look at it for what it is, and be comfortable with that term and with the vulnerability and with the impact that it has, so that we can start to make that connection that all change affects our emotional well-being, and that we as a community, as a group of people, get better and better and better equipped at actually being able to have those conversations that enable people to feel comfortable and have the trust and have that safe space to be able to talk about these things.
That's great, Gemma. Thank you. So finally, on behalf of the London HR Connection, can I thank all our three speakers for their contribution, For those of you who can use the clap button on Zoom, now's the time to do so. We have taken a recording of this, so we will make this available. We'll make it available. And indeed, Fraser will no doubt post on LinkedIn. So can I ask you to go on and give it as many likes as you can to get the message out there. Our next session, continuing the theme of the new way of working, is all going to be about virtual recruitment and virtual onboarding. We haven't yet pinned down a date, but that will be published very shortly. So thank you very much for attending, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, you done now? Shh.
Hilarious. Have fun in the garden. Thanks, guys. You're amazing.
That was my daughter.